Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, March 17th, 2016. This one I'm going to put down in the sort of the hit column. And I've got to preface what I want to talk about today by a bit of personal information. I was asked at the last minute last Tuesday by my friend and colleague Richard Hoagland to be on his overnight radio show. And he had another guest that had been scheduled, and he had to back out at the last minute, so I was invited on as kind of a replacement, and we were talking about the current American and geopolitical scene, and inevitably we got around to talking about Mr. Putin and Russia and the Russian intervention in Syria and the sudden withdrawal of a large part of Russia's ground forces that Mr. Putin had sent to Syria. And I offered the opinion to Richard that Mr. Putin's objective in Syria was accomplished, basically, and this is the reason for the withdrawal. And Mr. Hoagland asked me what I thought that objective had been, and I said, well, bluntly, it was to cripple ISIS, it was to stabilize the Assad regime, but more importantly, it was to steal a march. It was a public relations objective that Russia was really trying to accomplish here. Get in, do your military objective, get it accomplished, and then get out, as opposed to the American system. And that the objective really was to show the United States anti-terrorism effort up for essentially being the fraud that it is. We're familiar with the fact that America has, to a certain extent, largely supplied and helped and aided ISIS via its allies, its proxies in the region, namely Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So what Putin did was essentially, I think, a public relations stunt, if you will, that was designed ultimately to show up not only the American military effort, because Russia did in a very short time what America claimed it had been doing for several years, and basically restabilized the Assad regime and dealt some severe crippling blows to the financial flows from ISIS's trade in oil to Turkey, and basically crippled ISIS rather dramatically. And I didn't expect to have confirmation come out so quickly of that view. I ran into two articles that I'm going to be referring you to, that I've put the links in the YouTube video here for you. One is from Stratfor. This is a review of the Stratfor opinion on the Russian withdrawal from Syria that appeared in Russia's Sputnik. So in other words, this is the Russian take on Stratfor's take. And then a brief reference that I'm going to be making to the Zero Hedge article about all of this. So this is what Sputnik is saying about Stratfor, and this article is by Mikhail Klementiev, all right? And it begins this way, quote, Stratfor, an American private geopolitical intelligence firm often called the Shadow CIA, has compiled its own list of Russia's key priorities in Syria, the achievement of which prompted the newly announced partial pullout of its military from the country. The first, it suggests, is, quote, ensuring the stability of the allied Syrian government and, by extension, Russian interests in Syria. The second, it says, is demonstrating and testing its armed forces, which are undergoing a significant force modernization. The third is weakening the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations, especially given the large number of Russian nationals fighting in Syria among extremist factions. And the fourth and most important, it states, is for, quote, Russia to link its actions in Syria to other issues, including the conflict in the Ukraine, disputes with the European Union, and U.S. sanctions on Russia, unquote. And let me stop right there and mention that this was the other thing I suggested to Mr. Hoagland in the interview, was that by showing up the American effort for the hypocrisy, essentially, that it really is. The other thing that Mr. Putin was doing was he was putting linkage between Syria and the European sanctions on Russia. And these are terribly unpopular in Europe, particularly in Germany. There's growing unrest, as we know, in Europe and particularly in Germany. I hope to be blogging about that this week, with the immigration crisis that's going on in Europe and provoking now backlash politically. There have been local elections in Germany where Chancellor Merkel has lost 3 very key local state elections to basically political parties that are anti-immigration. All right. So in other words, Mr. Putin has played this extraordinarily well. Now let me continue with this little Sputnik article here. It says, quote, with regards to showcasing Russia's armed forces, the agency notes that the Russians have demonstrated their improved combat capabilities and some new previously unused weapons, which will likely contribute to important arms sales, including some to Iran, unquote. Now, this is also key because Putin did demonstrate some unique Russian jamming capabilities. This was first done with the USS Donald Cook incident a couple years ago. We saw it repeated again inside of Syria with jamming of Western communications, and we saw them use a cruise missile launched from the Caspian Sea. That weapon system was not supposed to have had the range that it did. And finally, he's injected those Russian anti-missile defense systems into Syria as well. So this is another big, I think personally, a big coup for Mr. Putin in demonstrating the military capabilities of the Russian army and Russian Air Force. Now, it goes on to say this, quote, the March 15th drawdown, which is coming just as UN peace talks begin in Geneva, could be a sign of a breakthrough in negotiations. It will be important to keep an eye on any signs that a deal emerging from Geneva and for indications coming out of Europe that could allude to a potential grand bargain. It states with regards to Russia's objective to link its action in Syria to other issues. And that, again, I think is quite true. I think that Stratfor and Sputnik's summary here are accurate as to what may come out of this. It is true that this was timed very carefully with those peace negotiations in Geneva. Now, Russia has not completely withdrawn. We have to emphasize this. Putin has left himself and has stated that he has maintained the option of re-injecting significant Russian military force within hours should he have to do so. So in other words, he's basically serving notice. Don't try and pull a fast one here, because we'll be back in a blink of an eye if we have to be. So this is very crucial, and I do think that we have to watch these negotiations coming up very carefully. Now, I want to go to the last paragraph of the zero hedge take on this withdrawal, because this too I think is significant, and again a little bit of confirmation that this was a very well played military diplomatic approach to the problem that Mr. Putin gave. Zero Hedge ends a very long article that they have, and I have it linked for you, where it says, quote, it would appear that Putin is A, confident that the rebels are as good as wiped out, having been surrounded and on the verge of being routed. B, is confident that Assad is secured. And C, would prefer the narrative to be success on his terms as he plays peacemaker and withdraws, leaving the U.S. aggressors behind, unquote. And again, I think that's very, very true. I think this is the perception. I think what Putin has done is that he is very deliberately targeting Europe now. He's targeting that growing discontent in Europe about the immigration crisis. He's targeting the growing discontent about the economic sanctions. And he has just seen, mark my words, this definitely is a factor in the Russian calculation here. He's just seen Chancellor Merkel take a drubbing, her political party, the Christian Democratic Union, inside of Germany, take a drubbing in local state elections in that country. So Europe's big spokesman, Germany, is now in a very weak position geopolitically. So this is going to be very interesting to see how Russia plays this out. Watch those negotiations in Geneva. And let's keep an eye, too, on what's coming out of Europe in response to all of this. Again, I think we have to watch France and Germany very closely, followed very closely by Great Britain and Italy, to see what their reaction to all of this is going to be. So that's it, folks, for this week's news and views from the Nefarium. I'll see everybody on the flip side. Don't forget, folks, Those of you who are members in Europe and Africa, we do have a members vid chat tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock U.S. Central Time. Bye-bye, everybody, and God bless.